On a summer morning in Chicago, veteran police Officer Bradley, known for his aggressive tactics, stops a luxury car driven by a black man. Without any justification, Bradley forces the driver, Marcus Reed, out of the vehicle and throws him to the ground, brutally pressing his face against the asphalt. Marcus Reed, a ruthless and respected judge known for his harsh sentences, finds himself in an unimaginable situation. The tension in the air is palpable as Bradley tries to exert his power without knowing he is about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion in the comments. The night was cold in Chicago when Judge Marcus Reed decided to drive home after a long court session. The streets were almost empty, except for a few police vehicles making their routine rounds. Reed barely noticed the patrol car following him until blue and red lights began flashing in his rearview mirror. Officer Bradley, a rookie eager to prove himself, approached the vehicle with exaggerated confidence. Without waiting for an explanation, he ordered Reed out of the car, his voice thick with unnecessary authority. The judge, tired and irritated by the interruption, hesitated for a moment, an error that Bradley interpreted as defiance. Within seconds, Reed found himself pressed against the hood of his own car, handcuffs tight around his wrists. Bradley barked orders, ignoring the judge's protests. It was only when Reed managed to mention his position that the officer stopped, the blood draining from his face as he recognized the name. The atmosphere changed instantly. Bradley, realizing his colossal mistake, began to stammer out apologies. But it was too late. The damage was done. And in Judge Reed's eyes, Bradley saw something that chilled him to the bone, a silent promise of retribution. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread like wildfire through the courthouse halls and city police stations. Reed, known for his unyielding integrity and unforgiving temper, has made no public comments. His silence was more terrifying than any verbal threat. Bradley, suspended pending investigation, found himself at the center of a media storm. His career, once promising, now hangs by a thread. He sought advice from lawyers, but few were willing to face Judge Reed's wrath. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of Chicago's power, a complex web began to form. Reed, with his deep connections in the justice system, quietly moved pieces. Politicians, lawyers, and even fellow judges were forced to choose sides. Tensions reached a fever pitch when Bradley was summoned to a disciplinary hearing. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Reed, sitting on the judge's bench, his face a mask of professional neutrality, seemed to have all the power in the world in his hands. But as the case unfolded, unexpected layers of complexity began to emerge. Questions about police abuse of power, judicial privilege, and the nature of justice itself were raised. What began as a simple case of police misconduct quickly turned into a test of the very foundations of the legal system. As witnesses were called and evidence presented, it became clear that neither Bradley nor Reed were quite what they seemed at first glance. Secrets came to light, alliances were tested, and the line between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. The city of Chicago watched, mesmerized, as the drama unfolded. In the streets, heated debates broke out about who was really right. It was a case that had the potential to redefine not only the careers of Bradley and Reed, but also the way justice was administered in the city. As the trial approached its climax, one question hung over everyone. In a system where everyone has something to hide, who can truly judge? The morning after the incident dawned with a different Chicago. The sun had barely risen when the first videos started circulating on social media. Shaky footage, captured on passers-by's smartphones, showed Judge Marcus Reed being brutally pushed against his car by Officer Bradley. The audio was choppy, but the words, "I am a judge," could be clearly heard, followed by the dry sound of handcuffs being closed. Within hours, the hashtag #OnJusticeAparaReed was trending everywhere. Local broadcasters interrupted their regular programming to cover the case. Reed's face, normally stern and composed, now contorted into an expression of pain and indignation, was on every screen in the city. In the 21st Police District, the phone didn't stop ringing. Captain Hernandez, a 30-year veteran of the force, felt his stomach sink as he saw the notifications on his cell phone. He knew Bradley, a promising cop, perhaps a little too eager to prove himself. But this was a public relations nightmare. "Bradley!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the halls of the police station. "In my office! Now!" Meanwhile, in the elegant apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Judge Marcus Reed watched the media coverage with almost clinical interest. His normally sharp eyes were slightly swollen from the previous night's confrontation. A bruise was beginning to form on his right temple, a painful reminder of Bradley's excessive force. Reed picked up his phone, ignoring the dozens of unread messages. He dialed a number that few had access to. "Sandra, it's Marcus. I need you to contact my PR team. We have work to do." Sandra Alvarez, Reed's chief of staff for more than a decade, was already on her way to the office. She knew the judge well enough to know this wasn't just about justice. It was an opportunity. On the streets of Chicago, the tension was palpable. Groups of protesters began to gather in front of the police department headquarters. Posters with "No one is above the law" and "Justice for all" were held up by angry hands. Back at the station, Bradley sat stiffly in the chair in front of Captain Hernandez's desk. His normally confident face was pale and covered in sweat. "Do you have any idea what you did?" Hernandez growled, throwing a tablet in front of Bradley. The video of the incident played on a loop, each repetition like a knife to the young officer's heart. "Captain, I didn't know he was a judge. He was resisting and I—" "Resisting," Hernandez interrupted, his voice rising an octave. "He's 60 years old, Bradley, and even if he was a private citizen, this approach was completely disproportionate." As the reprimand continued, Bradley's cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Need a lawyer? We're here to help police officers in difficult situations." Bradley swallowed. He knew this was just the beginning. At the Palace of Justice, the normally silent hallways were buzzing with whispered conversations. Judges, lawyers, and court staff exchanged worried glances. Judge Reed was known for his unyielding integrity and unforgiving temper. Many wondered how this would affect ongoing cases, especially those involving police. Reed's secretary, an efficient woman named Carol, was swamped with calls. Reporters, politicians, and even local celebrities. Everyone wanted a statement from the judge, but Reed remained silent, a silence that weighed on the city like a storm cloud about to burst. In the mayor's office, an emergency meeting was underway. The police chief, sweating profusely under the fluorescent lights, tried to explain how something like this could have happened. "Mr. Mayor, we are conducting a full internal investigation. Officer Bradley has been suspended without pay—" "No payment?" the mayor interrupted, his voice thick with disbelief. "Did you see the videos? Half the city is asking for his head on a platter." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that the next 48 hours would be crucial. How the city handles this could define the current administration. Meanwhile, in a small cafe a few blocks from the courthouse, a lone figure watched the commotion with interest. Lisa Greenwood, an ambitious young reporter for the Chicago Tribune, felt there was more to this story than met the eye. His journalistic instincts told him that both Reed and Bradley had secrets worth uncovering. Lisa opened her laptop and began typing furiously. She had contacts in the police department and the courthouse. It was time to make some calls, dig a little deeper. After all, in Chicago, nothing was as simple as it seemed at first glance. As the day progressed, the story took on national proportions. 24-hour news channels devoted entire segments to the case. Legal experts debated the legal merits. while political commentators speculated about the broader ramifications. At the center of it all, two men, a respected judge and a young police officer, found themselves in the eye of the storm. They both knew their lives would never be the same again. The question now was, who would come out on top in this dangerous game of power and public perception? As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the city's skyscrapers, one thing was clear: this story was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning of a battle that threatened to shake the very foundations of the city's judicial system. And somewhere, in the shadows, someone was smiling. Because amidst the chaos and confusion, opportunities arose. Opportunities that could change the balance of power in the Windy City forever. The sun had barely risen in Chicago when the first broadcast vans began to line up in front of the Palace of Justice. Reporters across the country, with deep bags under their eyes and cups of coffee in their hands, were preparing for another day of frenetic coverage. The case of Reed versus Bradley had become the epicenter of a media earthquake that shook the nation. On television screens from coast to coast, the face of Judge Marcus Reed was omnipresent. His expression, normally impassive, now carried a calculated mix of indignation and determination. Images of the incident, captured on smartphones, played on an incessant loop, each repetition fueling public outrage. In New York, the Good Morning America studio was buzzing with the nervous energy that precedes an explosive interview. Host Sarah Donovan took a deep breath as producers counted down. "We're on the air in 5, 4, 3. "Good morning, America," Sarah began, her professional smile masking the underlying tension. "Today we have with us, via satellite, Judge Marcus Reed of Chicago, at the center of the controversy that is rocking the country." The screen split, showing Reed in his office, the American flag strategically placed behind him. "Judge Reed, thank you for being with us this morning," Sarah began. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night?" Reed leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the camera. "Sarah, what happened to me is not something new. It is just the latest example of a systemic problem that has plagued our nation for decades. I was treated not as a judge, not as a law-abiding citizen, but as a threat, simply because of the color of my skin." Reed's words reverberated through the screens of millions of Americans. On social media, hashtags like Justiça para Reed and Policia Racista exploded in popularity. Meanwhile, in Officer Bradley's modest apartment, the young officer watched the interview with a mixture of horror and disbelief. His phone kept buzzing with messages of support from fellow officers and threats from angry strangers. The reality of his situation was beginning to settle like a crushing weight on his chest. Back in the studio, Sarah pressed Reed with pointed questions. "Judge Reed, some argue that your privileged position is being used to amplify this incident beyond its true importance. How do you respond to this criticism?" Reed smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, my position did not protect me that night. And it is precisely because of that position that I have a responsibility to speak out. How many others, without my resources or connections, suffer in silence?" On the streets of Chicago, the tension was palpable. Protesters gathered in front of the police department headquarters, their voices echoing through the downtown streets. Signs reading "No more police brutality" and "Justice for all" flapped in the wind. Inside the building, Police Chief Michael Brennan was facing his own hell. Reporters crowded into his makeshift press room, firing questions like bullets. "Chief Brennan, the Chicago Police Department has a history of racially motivated incidents. How does this fit into that pattern?" Brennan, sweating under the lights, tried to maintain her composure. "We are conducting a thorough and transparent investigation. Officer Bradley has been suspended pending the results of that investigation. We want to assure the public that we take these allegations very seriously." But his words sounded hollow in the face of the media storm that was brewing. Behind the scenes, Chicago's political machine was in action. The mayor, feeling the wind of public opinion, was preparing to make an announcement. His aides were working furiously on a speech that could calm tempers without alienating the powerful police union. Meanwhile, in a discreet downtown office, Lisa Greenwood, the young reporter for the Chicago Tribune, dove deep into her investigation. Something about this whole story didn't add up perfectly. Why was Reed driving alone so late at night? And why did Bradley, a police officer with a hitherto impeccable record, act so aggressively? Lisa flipped through stacks of documents, her laptop open with dozens of tabs. She knew there was more to this story than met the eye at first glance, and she was determined to discover the truth, no matter where it led. As the afternoon progressed, the nation eagerly awaited Judge Reed's official address. The Chicago courthouse turned into a media circus, with cameras and microphones pointed at the main entrance. Promptly at 5 p.m., Marcus Reed emerged, his imposing figure contrasting with the chaos around him. Silence fell over the crowd as he approached the podium. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice booming over the speakers, "what happened to me is a symptom of a deeper illness that afflicts our society. I am here not just as a judge seeking justice for himself, but as an American demanding that we live up to our highest ideals." His words were carefully chosen, each phrase a calculated blow against the system he claimed to defend. Reed spoke about equality, justice, and the need for police reform. He cited past cases, statistics, and laws, turning his speech into a master class on civil rights. "We cannot continue to pretend that these are isolated incidents," he declared, his voice growing in intensity. "It's time we face the uncomfortable truth. Racial bias is deeply rooted in our institutions, and it is our duty as citizens and as human beings to eradicate it." As Reed spoke, social media exploded. Political commentators dissected every word, activists shared excerpts from the speech, and ordinary citizens expressed their outrage and support. At the end of his statement, Reed made a surprising announcement. "I am filing a civil lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department and Officer Bradley, not for revenge, but for change. It's time we hold those in power accountable and demand a system of justice that serves everyone equally." The impact was immediate. Legal analysts rushed to television studios to debate the ramifications. The Chicago Police Department has gone into full crisis mode, and across the country, the conversation about race, power, and justice has reached a new level of intensity. As night fell over Chicago, the city and the country were at a boiling point. The case of Reed versus Bradley had morphed into something much greater, a catalyst for a national debate about the foundations of the American justice system. And in the midst of this hurricane, two men, a judge and a police officer, found themselves at the center of a storm that threatened to change the course of history. The legal battle was just beginning, and with it, a fight for the heart and soul of the nation. The sun rose over an unrecognizable Chicago. The streets, normally packed with scurrying business people and dazzled tourists, now pulsed with the electric energy of thousands of protesters. Posters flapped in the wind, their messages echoing the collective cry for justice. No more police brutality. Black Lives Matter. Reform the police now. In the center of this maelstrom, the Cook County Courthouse stood like a besieged fortress. Reporters from around the world crowded onto its steps, microphones in hand, ready to capture every nuance of this unfolding drama. Inside the imposing building, Judge Marcus Reed walked the silent hallways, his footsteps echoing off the marble walls. His face, normally a mask of judicial neutrality, now carried the weight of a divided nation. "Good morning, Judge Reed," greeted his assistant Carol, handing him a stack of papers. "Here's the summary of the global demonstrations. Paris, London, Tokyo. It seems like the whole world is watching." Reed nodded gravely, flipping through the reports. "And Bradley? Any news?" Carol hesitated. He disappeared, sir. No one has seen him since last night." The judge raised an eyebrow but did not comment. Instead, he headed to his private chamber, closing the door behind him. Meanwhile, in the 21st Police District, Captain Hernandez was facing his own personal hell. Journalists besieged the building, demanding answers. Inside, morale was at rock bottom. Veteran police officers looked over their shoulders, fearful of being the next target of public ire. "Captain," shouted a sergeant running down the corridor, "we just got a report. There's a crowd forming near Bradley's house." Hernandez swore under his breath. "Send a team there immediately. And someone, for God's sake, find Bradley." At City Hall, Mayor Richard Daley Jr. faced a room full of nervous aides. The air was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and anxiety. "Gentlemen," Daley began, his voice tense, "we stand on a precipice. If we don't act quickly and decisively, this city will implode." His chief of staff, a thin man named Thompson, cleared his throat. "Sir, we have a few options. We could announce an independent investigation, perhaps bring in someone from the outside to lead—" "No," Daley interrupted, slamming his fist on the table. "That's not enough. We need something big, something that shows we're truly committed to change." Silence fell over the room as the implications of those words hung in the air. While the powerful deliberated, tension continued to rise in the streets. In Grant Park, a young activist named Zoe Williams stood on a makeshift podium, her megaphone in hand. "Brothers and sisters," she shouted, her voice reverberating through the crowd. "How long will we tolerate a system that treats us like second-class citizens? How long will we accept that wearing a uniform is a license for brutality?" The crowd roared in response, their outrage fueling a fire that threatened to consume the city. On the other side of town, in a discreet bar frequented by police officers, a group of officers gathered, their voices low and tense. "This is crazy," muttered one of them, a 20-year veteran of the force. "They're treating us like we're all criminals." "Bradley made a mistake," replied another, younger one. "But what about all the days we risk our lives? Doesn't that count for anything?" The conversation was interrupted when the door opened, revealing a familiar figure. Silence fell over the bar as Officer Michael Bradley entered, his eyes red and puffy, his posture defeated. "Mike," someone whispered. "Where the hell have you been?" Bradley collapsed onto a bench, silently accepting the beer he was offered. I didn't know what to do. Everything fell apart so quickly." As Bradley struggled for words, across town, in a plush office overlooking Lake Michigan, a very different meeting was taking place. Lisa Greenwood, the Chicago Tribune reporter, sat across from a man whose identity she had sworn to keep secret. "So," she said, her recorder playing, "you're telling me there's more to this story than meets the eye?" The man, whose face was hidden by shadows, leaned forward. "Miss Greenwood, what happened that night was just the tip of the iceberg, Judge Reed. He's not the saint everyone thinks he is." Lisa felt her heart speed up. This could be the turnaround she was looking for. "Keep going," she encouraged. While the city buzzed with protests and speculation, in the corridors of power, a complicated dance was underway. Politicians, community leaders, and police chiefs moved like pieces on a chessboard, each trying to anticipate the other's next move. At the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., lights burned late into the night. The Chicago case had caught the attention of the Attorney General, who saw it as an opportunity to make a statement about police reform on a national level. Back in Chicago, Judge Reed prepared for his next move. In his private library, he reviewed decades of case law, searching for precedents that could strengthen his case. "Carol," he called his assistant, "schedule a press conference for tomorrow. It's time to raise our game." As night fell over the city, the tension was almost palpable. On the streets, small clashes between protesters and police threatened to escalate into something larger. The smell of tear gas hung in the air in some neighborhoods, mixing with chants of "no justice, no peace." In his sister's apartment, where he had taken refuge, Bradley watched the news with a mix of horror and fascination. His face appeared repeatedly on screen, sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a scapegoat for a larger system. "Mike," his sister said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you need to turn yourself in. This will only get worse if you keep hiding." Bradley nodded slowly, knowing she was right, but terrified of what awaited him. The next morning, the city woke up to a series of shocking developments. Headlines screamed from every newsstand and news feed. Judge Reed announces multi-million lawsuit against police department. Officer Bradley surrenders to authorities. Mayor promises radical changes in police policy. Federal investigation into Chicago. Police practices announced. The city, already on the edge of a precipice, now seemed ready to descend into total chaos. But amid the confusion, key figures moved with calculated precision. Judge Reed, impeccable in his dark suit, walked up the courthouse steps, a crowd of reporters at his heels. Her lawyer, a man named Marcus Greenwood, no relation to Lisa, walked beside her carrying a thick folder. "Judge Reed," shouted a reporter, "is it true you're suing the city for $50 million?" Reed stopped, turning to face the cameras. "This lawsuit is not about money," he declared, his voice firm. "It's about responsibility. It's about changing a system that has too long failed to protect all of its citizens equally." As Reed made his statement, across town, Officer Bradley was escorted into the Department of Internal Affairs. His lawyer, a burly man named Frank Mosley, known for defending police officers in controversial cases, spoke rapidly in his ear. "Don't say anything without me present, understand? Not a word." Bradley nodded mechanically, his eyes glassy, as if he still couldn't believe the situation he found himself in. At City Hall, Mayor Daley was preparing to make the most important announcement of his career. Surrounded by a team of public relations advisors and consultants, he rehearsed his speech one last time. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "today marks the beginning of a new era for Chicago. An era of transparency, accountability, and true justice for all." As the powerful made their moves, in the streets, the energy was electrifying. Protesters from all corners of the city converged on the center, their voices united in a chorus of demands for change. Lisa Greenwood, the tireless reporter, ran from location to location, her notebook full of observations and her mind spinning with the implications of everything she was witnessing. She knew she was in the middle of something historic, something that could redefine not just Chicago, but potentially the entire country. As the day progressed, it became clear that the incident between Judge Reed and Officer Bradley had escalated into something much bigger than anyone could have predicted. It was a turning point, a moment that required every citizen, every institution, to choose a side. And as the sun set over a Chicago in turmoil, one thing was certain. When the dust finally settled, the city, and perhaps the country, would never be the same. Chicago Police Department Hearing Room 305 seemed too small to contain the tension pulsing within. The rows of chairs were crowded, a sea of blue uniforms mixed with sober suits and anxious civilian faces. At the center of this maelstrom, sitting alone at a worn wooden table, was Officer Michael Bradley. Bradley, once a confident and respected police officer, now seemed a shadow of his former self. His pale face and deep circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights and days of incessant anguish. His eyes, once full of determination, now wandered nervously around the room, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. To his right, Frank Mosley, his lawyer, was sorting through a stack of papers, occasionally murmuring words of encouragement. but not even Mosley's comforting presence could dispel the oppressive feeling that this day would mark the end of Bradley's career, and possibly the beginning of something much worse. Across the room, Judge Marcus Reed sat bolt upright, his face a mask of studied neutrality. Despite his apparent calm, his eyes shone with an intensity that made those present shift uncomfortably in their seats. Beside him, Marcus Greenwood, his lawyer, occasionally whispered in his ear, receiving only barely perceptible nods in response. When the Chief of Internal Affairs, a stern woman named Patricia Donovan, entered the room, silence fell like a heavy curtain. She made her way to the central table, her heels clicking on the polished wooden floor. "This hearing is now in session," Donovan announced, his voice cutting through the tense air. "We are here to examine the events of the night of August 15th, involving Officer Michael Bradley and Judge Marcus Reed." Bradley swallowed, his Adam's apple visibly bobbing up and down. Mosley placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but the gesture seemed to do little to calm the young officer's nerves. "Officer Bradley," Donovan began, his eyes boring into the officer, "please tell us, in your own words, what happened that night." Bradley cleared his throat, his voice coming out hoarse and shaky. I was on routine patrol. I saw a car making an irregular turn and decided to make a standard approach." As Bradley narrated the events, the room seemed to tilt forward, each word hanging in the air like lead. He described how the driver, who he did not know was Judge Reed, seemed agitated and uncooperative. He talked about his ignored requests, about the feeling that the situation was getting out of his control. "I followed protocol," Bradley insisted, his voice taking on a tone of desperation. "I didn't know who he was. I was just trying to ensure my safety and his." Donovan nodded, his face unreadable. "And at what point did you decide to use physical force against Judge Reed?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Bradley hesitated, his eyes moving involuntarily to Reed, who was watching him with an unsettling calm. I misread your movements," Bradley admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he might be reaching for something. A gun, maybe. I reacted—" "You reacted," Donovan interrupted, "by pushing a 60-year-old man against his own car and handcuffing him for no apparent reason." The room erupted in murmurs, quickly silenced by a stern look from Donovan. Bradley slumped in his chair, looking smaller by the second. It was at that moment that Judge Reed stood up, his imposing figure dominating the room. "If I may, Chief Donovan," he said, his voice deep and controlled, "I would like to make a statement." Donovan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Proceed, Judge Reed." Reed walked to the center of the room, his steps measured and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of legal experience and the fire of long-suppressed indignation. "What happened to me that night," he began, "is not an isolated incident. It's not just about a police officer making a bad judgment. It's about a system that allows and even encourages such bad judgments." The room was mesmerized, Reed's every word falling like a hammer on the collective consciousness. How many others, without my position or resources, suffer daily at the hands of a system that sees them as threats before seeing them as citizens? How many young Black and Latino people are accosted, searched, humiliated, simply for existing in public spaces? Reed paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "I am not here to seek revenge against Officer Bradley. He is a symptom, not the cause. I am here to demand change. Deep systemic change in how we train our police officers, in how we define public safety, in how we build trust among law enforcement and the communities they are supposed to protect." As Reed spoke, Bradley's face went through a series of emotions: shame, confusion, and finally, painful realization. He was beginning to understand that he was part of something much bigger than himself, a pawn in a game whose rules he barely understood. In the back of the room, Chicago Tribune reporter Lisa Greenwood was furiously taking notes. She knew she was witnessing history in the making, a turning point not just for Chicago, but potentially for the entire country. Reed continued, his voice gaining strength. We need complete reform, de-escalation training, implicit bias education, greater community engagement. We need an accountability system that doesn't protect bad actors, but supports those who genuinely strive to serve and protect. As he spoke, the eyes of many of the officers present lowered, some in reflection, others in discomfort. Reed's words were touching on truths that many would rather ignore. This is not an attack on police, Reed emphasized. It's a call for us to be better, for us to live up to the ideals we swore to uphold, for us to build a justice system that is truly fair for all. When Reed finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Donovan, visibly shaken, took a few moments to regain her composure. Thank you, Judge Reed, she finally said. Your words will be given the weight they deserve. The hearing continued, with witnesses being called and evidence presented. But it was clear to everyone present that the real trial was no longer about Bradley's actions that night, but about the entire system that allowed those actions to occur. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the room seemed to shift. What began as a disciplinary hearing had become a forum for a much larger debate about race, power, and justice in America. Bradley, watching all this, felt the weight of his own insignificance. He had entered that room fearing for the end of his career, but now he understood that he was in the middle of something much bigger than himself. When the hearing finally came to an end, Donovan made his final statement. This commission will take into consideration all of the evidence and testimony presented today. A decision regarding Officer Bradley will be announced in the coming days. But beyond that, I am recommending a complete review of the Chicago Police Department's policies and practices. As the room began to empty, Reed approached Bradley. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the gulf between their life experiences seemingly unbridgeable. Officer Bradley, Reed said, his voice surprisingly gentle. I hope you understand that this isn't personal. It's about changing a system that fails not only people like me, but also officers like you. Bradley nodded slowly, unable to find words. When Reed walked away, Bradley felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by an even greater responsibility. Outside the building, a crowd waited anxiously for news. Journalists crowded, cameras flashed, and the tension was palpable. When Reed emerged, a roar rose from the crowd. He raised his hands, asking for silence. Today, he began, his voice carrying over the sea of people. We took the first step on a long and necessary journey. It's not about one incident or one individual. It's about rewriting the social contract between those who enforce the law and those she must protect. As Reed spoke, Bradley watched from a second-story window. He saw the crowd. He saw the signs demanding justice. He saw the hopeful faces and the raised fists. And for the first time since that fateful night, he began to understand. Night fell over Chicago, but the city hummed with renewed energy. On the streets, in houses, in bars and cafes, people discussed what they had witnessed. A feeling of change hung in the air, a feeling that something fundamental had been altered. And in his office at the courthouse, Judge Marcus Reed sat alone, gazing at the Chicago skyline. He knew the battle was far from over. In fact, she had barely started. But today, he thought, today they took the first step towards a better future. Meanwhile, in a discreet bar on the city's south side, Lisa Greenwood met with her anonymous source. So, she said, leaning forward, you mentioned there was more to the story. Something about Judge Reed. The source smiled enigmatically. Miss Greenwood, you have no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes. And so, as one story seemed to come to an end, another just began to unfold. In the Windy City, the winds of change were blowing strong, promising to reveal long-buried secrets and challenge the very foundations of power and justice. Judge Marcus Reed adjusted his tie as he prepared for another meeting. His reflection in the elevator mirror showed a determined man, but with traces of tiredness that not even his impeccable posture could hide. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions and politics, and Reed knew the real battle was just beginning. The elevator doors opened on the 15th floor of the Chicago Municipal Building, revealing a hallway full of anxious faces. Community leaders, civil rights lawyers, and some progressive politicians awaited his arrival. Reed greeted each of them with a firm handshake and an encouraging smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating in the packed conference room, "I appreciate everyone's presence. We are here today to discuss not only what happened to me, but to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." As Reed laid out his comprehensive police reform plan, eyes in the room lit up with a mix of hope and skepticism. He spoke about improved de-escalation training, greater civilian oversight, revised use of force policies, and a new accountability system for officers with histories of misconduct. "This isn't just about changing some rules," Reed emphasized. "It's about changing an entire culture, a culture that for too long has valued strength over compassion, fear over understanding." Hands went up, questions were asked. Heated debates erupted. Reed watched with satisfaction as the room vibrated with energy and purpose. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that real change was possible. But reality began to set in over the following weeks. Reed marched from office to office in the city's bureaucratic labyrinth, his footsteps echoing in the corridors of power. At each stop he encountered polite smiles, vague promises, and more often, closed doors. On a particularly frustrating afternoon, Reed found himself in Mayor Daley's office. The politician, known for his ability to navigate the turbulent waters of Chicago politics, listened with an expression of studied sympathy. "Judge Reed," Daley began, leaning forward in his leather chair, "you have to understand. Changes like these take time. We can't just turn the police department upside down overnight." Reed felt the familiar wave of frustration rising in his chest. "With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, time is exactly what we don't have. As we speak, people are suffering at the hands of a broken system." Daley sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I understand your frustration, Marcus, but you have to see the bigger picture. The police union is furious. Conservative politicians are screaming about being soft on crime. And honestly, most voters will forget all this in the next crisis." Reed stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "So that's it? Are we just going to sweep it all under the rug and hope people forget?" The mayor stood as well, his face a mask of political calm. "We're making changes, Marcus. Baby steps. That's how progress works in this city. You know that better than anyone." As Reed left the office, he couldn't help but feel like he had just witnessed a masterclass in how to keep up appearances while avoiding any real change. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Reed watched with increasing dismay as his proposals were watered down, delayed, or simply ignored. The police department announced with great fanfare a new cultural awareness training program, but details were vague and funding was minimal. On a particularly dark night, Reed found himself alone in his office, the city lights twinkling outside his window. He flipped through a stack of reports, each detailing how his proposals had been considered and archived for future review. A soft sound made him look up. Carol, his longtime assistant, stood in the doorway, a worried expression on her face. "Judge Reed," she said softly, "there is someone here to see you." Reed frowned, checking his watch. It was late, well after visiting hours. "Who is it?" "Officer Michael Bradley, sir." Reed felt a wave of contradictory emotions, surprise, anger, Curiosity. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. "Send him in." Bradley entered the room, looking smaller and younger than Reed remembered. His eyes were tired, his back bowed under the invisible weight of guilt and regret. "Judge Reed," he began, his voice shaking. I came to apologize. Not just for what I did, but for everything that happened afterward." Reed watched the young officer for a long moment. "Sit down, Officer Bradley," he finally said, gesturing to a chair. Bradley sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I saw what you tried to do," he continued, "the changes you proposed, and I saw how the system, how we resisted it." Reed leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Bradley. "And what do you think about that, officer?" Bradley swallowed. I think you're right, and that we're wrong to resist. But it's hard, to change, to admit that what we do, what we've always done, might be wrong." Reed felt an unexpected pang of empathy. "Change is never easy, Bradley, especially when it challenges everything we thought we knew." The two men talked for hours, their low voices echoing in the empty office. They talked about fear, about prejudice, about the weight of expectations and traditions, and slowly, something began to change in the air between them. When Bradley finally got up to leave, there was a new light in his eyes. "Thank you, Judge Reed," he said, extending his hand. "For what it's worth, I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be better, do better." Reed shook the young officer's hand, feeling a spark of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. "That's all we can do, Bradley. Try to be better every day." After Bradley left, Reed remained in his office, gazing out at the city. Chicago, with all its contradictions and complexities, seemed to perfectly reflect the struggle he had faced over the past few months. He thought about all the unfulfilled promises, the watered-down reforms, the seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But he also thought about Bradley, about how an honest conversation could plant the seeds of change. Reed knew the battle was far from over. The system, deeply rooted in decades of tradition and entrenched interests, would not change overnight. But maybe, he thought, real change didn't come from the top down. Maybe it would start with conversations like the one I had just had, with small moments of understanding and empathy. As he prepared to go home, Reed made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to fight, not just in the corridors of power, but in the streets, in communities, in people's hearts and minds. Change could be slow, it could be frustrating, but it was possible. The sun was beginning to rise over Chicago when Reed finally left his office. The streets, still sleepy, seemed full of possibilities. And although the road ahead was long and uncertain, Reed knew that every step, no matter how small, took them in the right direction. As he walked to his car, Reed noticed a young reporter waiting near the building's entrance. He recognized Lisa Greenwood, the journalist who had tirelessly covered his story. "Judge Reed," she called, approaching with a notepad in hand. "Can I just ask you one question?" Reed stopped, considering for a moment before nodding. "Just one, Miss Greenwood. It's getting late, or early, depending on how you look at it." Lisa smiled briefly before turning serious. "After everything that's happened, after all the broken promises and watered-down reforms, do you still believe that real change is possible?" Reed looked at the city skyline, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to gild the skyscrapers. He thought about Bradley, about all the difficult conversations he'd had over the past few months, about the small victories and the big defeats. "Miss Greenwood," he began, choosing his words carefully, "real change is more than possible. It's inevitable. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it rarely comes from where we expect it. It comes from difficult conversations, from people willing to question their own beliefs, small acts of courage and compassion." He paused, his eyes meeting the young reporter's. The system may be resilient, but it's made of people, and people can change. That's what I believe, and that's what I'll keep fighting for." Lisa quickly wrote it down, her eyes shining with a mix of wonder and skepticism. "Thank you, Judge Reed. That gives food for thought." As Reed got into his car, he couldn't help but smile. Maybe the story hadn't ended as he expected. Maybe the system hadn't been turned upside down overnight. But the conversation continued. The fight continued. And as long as there were people willing to talk, listen, and change, there was hope. The car's engine purred to life, and Reed drove through the waking streets of Chicago. The city, with all its challenges and promises, stretched out before him. A new day was beginning, and with it, a new chapter. Not the ending he had imagined, but a beginning full of possibilities. And so, the story of Judge Marcus Reed and his fight for justice did not end with a great triumph or a crushing defeat. It ended, or rather continued, with the promise of more work to be done, more hearts and minds to be changed, one step at a time. For in the search for justice and change, the true test is not the end result, but the willingness to keep fighting, even when the road is long and progress is slow. As the sun rose in the Chicago sky, illuminating a city still struggling with its contradictions and injustices, Reed knew that his journey, and the journey of all those seeking a more just world, was far from over. It was just another chapter in a much bigger story, a story that would continue to be written, page by page, day after day, by all those brave enough to dream of a better tomorrow.